CSS is easy. Think about it. Every web developer, when he's starting to learn CSS, the CSS is the basics thing that he's learning and it's the most easiest thing to learn. And CSS is so easy that I don't understand why we are talking about CSS right now. Not really. Maybe the basic things in CSS are really easy to understand. But when we are starting to create more and more complicated stuff like CSS architecture, here things starting to be a lot more complicated and web developers are really struggling with. And if you are not thinking about how you want to organize the CSS code becoming to be a CSS spaghetti code. It can happen in every programming language, but in CSS it can get the worst from all the programming languages. And the CSS file is starting to be like a huge garbage of CSS selector, and I call it the cascading style sheet file because it's look like, you know, and it's really hard to create some changes and to work with CSS for a lot of web developers when you don't think about how you want to organize styles and you change one thing and it's breaking you in another place. And it can be very frustrating for web developers to work in the CSS part. But before we will talk about how to create CSS architecture, let me represent myself. I'm Elad Shechter and I'm working as a CSS HTML architect. It's meaning that I'm doing in my main job CSS architecture for huge scale websites. Besides of this, I love to do a lot of stuff about CSS like writing in articles, talking about CSS like here, and beside of it, I created the CSS Master Israel community in Israel. And now let's talk about the basic things that you want to do when you are creating the CSS part. You want to know how you want to organize the CSS part. And I still think that even in the year of 2021, one of the best way to arrange the CSS code is to work with one of the CSS preprocessors. And I'm using in the last 10 years the SAS preprocessor in every one of my projects. And now let's talk about a type of CSS architecture that I love the most, CSS storytelling architectures. Why it's called CSS storytelling? Because the architecture from this type is storytelling. They are creating a story in the code. You already know the atomic design, that it's telling a story about how to create from small part, more complicated part, and more complicated part. This is a story, and if you are thinking about it, it's not connected to the web development world. It's more connected to the physical world that we have outside from the computer. But it helps us to understand the code in a better way. We have even more type of storytelling architecture like the IT CSS of Harry Robert. That's saying that the basic partials, we will use them in all of our projects. But when we will have more specific part, we'll use them at the end in very explicit places. But I'm not going to teach you now these both methodologies because you can go to YouTube and see those amazing CSS architectures. But I'm working a little bit different and I'm creating my own CSS architecture. And yes, I took some ideas from other CSS architecture that you maybe just saw. But because I'm working different, I want to show you how I'm creating my own CSS architecture. And let's start with the basic thing that we have these days. These days, we have a lot of CSS native variables, or in the second name, CSS custom properties. And we need to think about how we want to organize them. Because if you are not thinking about how to organize those CSS native variables, you're starting to get a lot of them. And I see that a lot of web developers really love to use them. And we have, in some example, quite in a lot of times, sometimes hundreds of CSS native variables. Like in this example, this is the inspect element that I've done in the LinkedIn website. It has 439 CSS native variables. And it's not bad to have so many CSS native variables, but it's really hard to adjust if you don't try to categorize them into separated categories. And because of that, my recommendation is to divide them into categories. But not only them. You need to think about how to categorize everything in your style project. and I think in every web development world, but we are now talking about CSS. And because of that, every categories of CSS native variables is being separated to a separated SAS file. As you can see here, this is a SAS file for all those CSS native variables. And if I have common sizes, I have another files of all those CSS native variables of common sizes. And after that, the only thing that I need to do is to import them, all of them together for a main file for all those CSS native variables. I calling this file name according to the project name and edit the CSS variable text. And this main file is sitting in the main project name style folder that's sitting in another folder of the style, main style folder. And the only thing that this main file, SCSS file, is doing import for all those categories of CSS native variables files, and all of them are sitting in the next sibling folder, and I just import all of them with this main SCSS file. And after that, this main SCSS file is being compiled to a separated CSS file that inside we have only those CSS native variables, nothing else. And I'm just import it into the add the HTML element of the project. And now we need to talk about all the other partials that we have in our project in the style categories. And these days, because we are working with SAS, we have two kinds of main categories that we need for our partials in SAS. We have all those categories that when they are being compiled, they are being disappeared from the code. It's all the no-style partials that we can create with SAS. If you are thinking about it, SAS variables are being vanished when they are being compiled. And we have SAS mixins and SAS functions. When the SAS is being compiled, all of these parts are being deleted from the code, and they are being used in the second category of the hasStyle part. In the hasStyle part, we have all the other partials that create us some styles when they are being compiled. For example, CSS Reset, CSS fonts, CSS icons, all the other partials, components, and every type of partials will be in this second side of category. And now we need to create this separation in our own code. How I'm doing it? Beside the main SCSS file for the CSS native variables, I have another main file that I'm calling it according to the project name and just .scss. The only thing that it does is doing import for those two main categories, the no style category and the hasStyle categories. And the only thing that those files are doing they are importing all the other categories, the inner subcategories that we have in every one of those categories. The no styles is doing import for all the main categories of no styles that are sitting in the sibling folder of no styles. And the hasStyle is doing import for all the main category of the things that hasStyle that we just saw. And now let's take a look on the main project name SCSS file, how it's looking inside. As you can see, the only thing that it's doing is importing these both categories of no style and hasStyle. And there, as you can see, in all the names of the files, the inner part of the file have an underscore and of course the .scss file name. And the underscore represents a file, a SCSS file that I don't want it to be compiled to a separated CSS file. But when you are doing the import, you don't need to write this underscore and the end file name, and instead you can just write it like this. I think this is quite a lot more readable, but do whatever you want. You can do it in that way or in this way. And now let's take a look what we have in the main no style folder. What exactly we have, how it's built inside. Let's first dive into the main no style CSS file, and we will see that the only thing that it is doing an import for all those main categories of SAS variables, SAS mixins, and SAS functions. And all of those main categories are sitting in the main no style folder that we just saw. And the SAS variable, because we have quite of them, again, you need to separating everything into categories. This day, I'm using quite a lot less SAS variables because we have the CSS native variables. But sometimes we cannot use them for specific cases. Like I'm using SAS variable to create the media rules of responsive design. Because in these days, we have a lot of separated components, and I want to put the responsive style in every one of the components. In this way, I can create common media rules that are using SAS variables, and in this way, if I need to update the media rules, I can do it from one place. And this is the example of how I'm creating SAS variables for those media rules. And let's talk about the main mixin CSS file. As you can see here, everything is being separated into categories, everything. As you can see here, I'm just creating an import for all those small mixin, and I'm separating everything to categories. In this way, when I'm looking in separated mixin files, it's a lot more clear to understand because you're seeing only one mixin at a time. And as you can see, all of them are being import from the main mixin folder. Everything, there is another sibling folder that I'm just putting their mixin in there. And let's take a look on one of those mixins. This is the mixin of break word. And why we need such a mixin? For example, in the internet, when you are creating a website, sometimes you are using content from the users. Let's say the comment section in the bottom. And maybe the user can write the word no with thousands of O. And because it doesn't have any space inside the word, it can break your layout, and you don't want it to happen. Because of that, we have some different implementation in CSS to create this break word. But the problem that every browser implemented it in a different way, and sometimes you have two implementation. And in this mixin, it's creating you the most consistent way to break words. And I really love to use this mixin. It's not my mixin. I took it from the CSS Tweak website that you can see the link in the bottom. And now let's recap everything, because we talk about here on a lot of things. First, we talk about the project name CSS variables that doing import for all those CSS native variables categories that are sitting in the CSS variables folder. Yes? This is doing import for all of this, and this is compiled to separated CSS file. After that, we talk about the main project name, SCSS file that is doing import for the two main categories of no style and S style. And until now, we just talk about the no style category that's doing import for all the subcategories of SAS variables, SAS mixin, and SAS functions. And every one of them is doing import for all its own partial in the sibling folders with the same name. And now let's talk about the has style category. Here we have all the other partials in our project that have style. For example, CSS Reset. And first you need to understand why we need CSS Reset in the first place. If you didn't know, every browser's loading its own CSS styles. For example, because of that, we have the bullets on list HTML element, and all the H1, H2, H3, H4 element have different font size, different font weight, and even some margins. But the problem is that some of the browsers sometimes don't implement it in the same way. And this can create us some inconsistent differences between different browsers. And let's take, for example, and let's say, for example, that the H1 element has, by default, in most of the cases, font size of 2 EM. But let's say that Internet Explorer implemented in a different way, with font size of 1.5 EM. Now we have CSS Reset that can solve us this problem. One of those CSS Reset is called the CSS Normalize. CSS Normalize saying that if one of the browser implemented in a bad way or in a different way, we will fix the specific problem of the specific element that is being rendered in a different way in one of the browsers. For example, the H1 element, if all of the browser is working with the same font size of 2 EM, and Internet Explorer is working with font size of 1.5 EM for the H1 HTML element, we will put on the H1 element font size of 2 EM. And in this way, Normalize is creating normalization in all the browsers. But we have even more type of CSS Reset. One of the CSS Reset is called CSS Reset of Eric Meyer. Eric Meyer is saying another thing. In most of the cases, we don't want to use the default style that are coming with the browsers. These days, when I'm using list HTML element, I'm using them for main navigation and a lot of other stuff, and I don't need the bullets and all those H1, H2, H3 element. I want to declare my own font size. I don't need that it will come from the browsers. And what the CSS of Meyer is doing is just resetting all the HTML elements. This huge CSS selector going over all those HTML elements, remove the margin, the padding, the border, font size, font weight, everything. But I don't like this way that this specific CSS reset is working, because when you are debugging the code, every HTML element that you will do inspect, it will show you this long, huge CSS selector in the developer toolbar of Chrome or any browser, and it will be very hard to understand what you are seeing when you are debugging the code web, when you are seeing all those noises of all those huge CSS selector. And don't understand me wrong, I agree with the idea of CSS reset. I just don't agree on how it being implemented, because in most of the cases, there are a lot of HTML elements that you are seeing right now that don't need the margin, the padding, because they are without any margin and padding. And because of that, I'm working in a little bit different way with all the reset part. My CSS reset is being created from 3 different kinds of CSS reset. First, I'm using the CSS normalize of Nicholas Gallagher as is. And I have my own CSS custom CSS reset and another reset file. This is how my main reset CSS file is look like. I have the normalize that I'm using it as is. I'm not changing anything in the normalize, just downloading the last version. And the second file is the CSS reset that I'm creating for myself. I'm creating it in a different way. As you can see here, I'm targeting specific HTML element, like all the element, and I give them box size and border box. In this way, it's more easy to calculate the sizes in CSS. I'm removing the style of the links and the buttons and list margin and padding and the list style. I'm just removing them. And for the H1 until H6 element, as you can see, I'm removing the margin, the font size, and the font weight. In this way, I'm just removing the specific stuff that need to be removed. And in this way, when I'm doing inspect element, let's say, for example, to the H3 element, I won't see a huge selector. I will see only the H1 until H6 selector. And when I will see it in the developer toolbar of Chrome, I will understand this is the part of the CSS reset, and it will be a lot more smaller and easier to understand. But as I told you, I have 3 CSS reset. The last one is a very special one, because it's changing according to the specific project. Here we are describing the basic typography in our own project. Here we will define the basic font family, the basic font size, maybe a different line height from the basic of the browsers. And if you don't want that the text color will be black, you can maybe define it dark gray in this part of the project. And I have another special things. I'm putting on the HTML element a font size of 6.25%. In this way, every 1 rem unit will be equal to 1 pixel. And for the body, as you can see, I'm putting font size of 16 rem. It's meaning that it's equal to 16 pixel. In this way, I can work with rem and still think in pixel. And it's helped me a lot to understand what is the unit that I'm just seeing right now. And if I need to increase everything with an accessibility button, I just need to change the font size from the HTML element, and that's it. Okay, and now let's talk about something very important. Important rule. I think a lot of the web developers thinking that important is always a bad thing. But sometimes important is important to use. Let's talk about when important can be good for us. Utility classes. In my type of CSS architecture, I'm not having a lot of utility class. This is very small part for my project. But when I'm using those utility classes, I always want them to win. For example, if I have utility class, that's something that need to be hide. And utility classes always starting with the letter U with a prefix of the U letter. Why it's so important? Because when you are reading the classes from the HTML, when you will see the letter U, you will understand that this is a utility class that's doing only one operation. U hide some stuff. And the U hide has the property of display with the value of none and the important rule. And why it's so important to use the important? Let's talk about this example. As you can see here, dot bar under the foo class has a display flex. This one, this HTML element. And if I want to hide the bar class and I want to do it with utility class, I need to put it the uHide class. And if I won't have here the important, because this is a specificity of 2 classes, it will override the uHide class. But every time that I'm using the uHide class, I want that this HTML element will be hidden. And because of that, I'm using here the important rule. And if I don't want that this element will be hidden, I'm just removing this class name of uHide. This class is doing only one operation. If you don't need it, remove it. And this is how my main utility SCSS files look like. I have really minor things. This is from an old project, but this is the idea of how I'm working with utilities classes. And now let's talk about the grids, the main layout of the website. Here we will put it in this layer. And a lot of web developers really afraid from creating those layouts. It's something big, something hard, because they really remember all the old ways that we have been using it with tables, floats, inline block, terrible way. But these days, we have CSS Grid, and to create layouting with CSS Grid, it's so easy. I'm not going to teach you right now, but believe me, to create this layout, this is 5 minutes when you're understanding CSS Grid. And you have a link if you want to test it out. And now let's talk about where we are putting all the other partials. Here we have all of the type of component. I'm not calling them components because one of the type of the partial is a component, but I have all those small partial, big partial in this layer, and it's a lot of partials. And because there are quite a lot, I'm separating them again into categories. All of them are sitting in the sibling folder of partials. And as you can see here, I have the basic partial. I'm calling them elements, after that components, sequences, entities, and pages. And as you can see here, in some of the cases, I'm using numbers in the beginning of the file name. Why I'm doing so? Because sometimes there is importance in which order I'm loading them. And if the basic partials, some of the components depends on the basic partials of elements, in this way I'm always sure that the component can use the element and maybe to change them and override them if you need. And you can maybe use it for other things and not only for style. Think about it. It will help you to order some file names if you have an exact order that you need to use. And when you are looking in the folder, you will see them in the right order. It's nice to have it. And let's take a look how the partial SCSS file is looking in the folder. As you can see here, it's sitting under the S-style category. The partials doing import for all the type of categories that's sitting in the partials SCSS folder, partials folder. As you can see here, all the main categories have their own SCSS file, elements, components, sequences, entities, and pages, and every one of them is doing import for its own files in the categories that's sitting under elements folder, components folder, sequences, and so on and so on. Okay, now let's talk about all of those categories. Elements partial, like their name, are elements, in most of the cases, at least. And as you can see here, I have classes for H1, H2, H3 element. I have classes for link and buttons. And one of the most important things that when you are targeting elements, do not target HTML element, because this can create you a lot of problems. I'm in 99.99% of the cases targeting only class name, never HTML element. And it's very important because let's say, for example, you have this section title and it's on H2 element, but the SEO will tell you to change it to H4, to H1, to div. I don't know why, because this is what they want. In this case, the design will stay the same, but only the HTML will change. In this way, you can disconnect between those ideas. Design for design and HTML element for accessibility, semantic, SEO, I don't care. And even for links, I have a class of common link. Why I need it? Because most of the links these days doesn't look like links. They look like buttons, like in the main navigation and a lot of other places. And if I need that a specific link will look like a link, I have a class of common link. And for the button, the same way, I have a class of common button. And in this way, if you need a link that will look like a button, you can now give the link a class of common button. And if you need a button that will look like a link, you can give the button class of common link. Nice. And let's see one of the partials, the elements partial. This is the common button element partial. The basic style will be here. But I want to show you another thing, state classes. State classes describe state for this specific element or this specific partial. You can have it in any partial. In some cases, we have default states from CSS, like the disable pseudo class. But in other case, if you need to create your own state class, I'm doing it with the prefix of is invert, is full line, is clear. Why it's so important to put this prefix? Because when I'm reading the HTML, it's a lot more clear for me to understand. Button, class common button, is full line. Common button is full line. This is a kind of a story, and it helps me to understand the connection between these both class names. Think about it. Now let's see how all those elements are being imported. We have the main elements SCSS file that's doing import for all those small elements. The second type of partial is the component partial. As its name, it's more bigger. It's a component. This is the main header component, and as you can see, we have inside other partial. It can be other elements or other components like the common button that we just saw. And maybe the only thing that the main header is doing is just layouting all the other partials that we have inside. And all those, all of those component partials are being imported from the main component CSS file. And if you have a lot of them, you can separate them into categories. Like as you can see here, those main parts are all the parts that are being seen in all of the pages of the website, and the other parts are all the other partials that are being seen only in some of the pages. After that, we have the sequences partials. The sequences partial are really another type of components, but because I'm working in the last 10 years, 8 years in 2 big news companies in Israel, I saw that I have a lot of types of component of news in my project, and because of that I wanted to separate them into another category, the category that I call them sequences of news. And if you don't see here what components of news we have here, I will just color them for you. 3 different components of news, and all these components in news I'm just import them from the main sequences SCSS file for separated component of news that I'm calling them sequences. And now we want to describe all the stuff that doesn't have any common style in our project. And why it's so important? Because we as web developers always think about how to create everything common. But in some of the cases it's not common to use common. It's not correct to use common. Because sometimes you have the same component in 6 different ways, and this creates you a huge salad of a lot of components that you don't know what you need to choose from. And sometimes there are only small differences between component 1 and component 2. And I wanted to describe these uncommon styles on those uncommon cases. And let me show you one example. This is an example of common pop-up. A really popular use case of common pop-up that I'm using almost in every one of my websites these days. But in one case, I needed to create a date picker pop-up that is looking a little bit different from the common pop-up. And because of that, I created the entity class. The entity class is describing an entity of another component. This is a class of component, a class of common pop-up. And if I need some to create it a little bit different for the case of date picker pop-up, I'm adding this class with the prefix of e, meaning entity, and I'm describing why it needs to look different. E, date picker pop-up, and I understand that this is a variation of the common pop-up. And in this way, I'm just creating in the entity the class of e date picker pop-up, and I can change some style or override some style or add some style in this case. And as you can see here, I'm using only one class selector. I don't try to override it with 2 classes. And how I'm so sure that one class can override me the style of the common pop-up is the way that I already built the structure of the loading of all those type of partials. Remember, the component is layer number 2. Entity is layer number 4. It's always come after. In this way, I know that even a one class selector of eDatePicker pop-up can override the class of common pop-up. The cascading. And it's very important to know that you're not allowed to create an entity of another entity. And why it's important not to create an entity of another entity? Let's say you have this date picker pop-up, And now, I don't know why, but you need to create the date picker pop-up in another way that you have to create another entity. It's better to copy the style between of them and to change only the things that you need. And yes, I know that it's sound bad, but you don't want to create a connection between them. You don't want that the date picker 1, if you change something, it will break you the style in the date picker 2. And because of that, even in those cases, it's better to duplicate the style into 2 separated entities, and maybe to check why you need the second entity. And you need to remember that beside the entity class, maybe you have another way to create the second version of the common of the date picker pop-up. For example, beside the entity classes, you can add the state classes as many as you want with the is class or utility class that doing only one operation. You can add as many as you want as well. Just only one entity class per partial. And now let's talk about another type of an entity for pages. In the web, we are working with pages, and yes, this isn't the most good thing to use, but sometimes it can help us in some cases. And in every one of the pages, I have a dynamic class name that I'm creating on the body HTML element according to the type of the page. As you can see here, this is the home page, and P represent a page. P prefix for pages. And if I now want to color all those partials of common pop-up, let's say with the background color pink only in the home page, I'm creating me this P homepage class that can color me all those common pop-up from white to pink with the background color of pink. And you can do it in other ways. You can give all the common pop-up in the home page a prefix state classes of isPink to add another class of isPink, and in this way you don't need this class name. But sometimes if you need it only for 1 week or for a specific case, it's maybe better to use the P entity class of pages instead of adding all this specific page, all those state classes. And now let's recap everything, because we talked here a lot about a lot of things. Yes? First, we talk about the project name, CSS native variables, that's doing import for all those CSS native variables categories that are sitting in the CSS variables folder. This is being compiled to separated CSS file. Remember in the beginning? After that, we talk about the main project name SCSS file that is doing import for the 2 main categories of no style and has style files, and every one of them is doing import for all its files on its own categories of the one of the no style and the S style from the S style. And these both main files are being compiled to separated CSS file, and the only thing that you need to do now is just import both of them, one for all those CSS native variables. In this way you can use them everywhere in the project, and of course all the other stuff that and the other style that we have in our own project with the main project name CSS file. But these days we are working a lot with React, Vue, Angular, a lot of framework that we have a lot of independent components. And it's good to work with independent component in most of the cases. And I needed a way to describe another way to work with independent components. And because we created a separation of no style and has style, we can now use all the common power or the big powers that we are getting with Sass if we are loading all the partials of the no style folder. Remember? And in this way, every independent component can get all the powers of Sass, like all those Sass variables, Sass mixins, Sass functions. How I'm doing it? I just need to load in every one of the component the main no style SCSS layer. How I'm doing it? In this way, just import the independent component, the no style SCSS file. In this way, I'm getting all the powers that we have in Sass, all the Sass variables, Sass mixins, and Sass functions. And you need to remember that even if I'm doing this import in every one of those separated components, it's not blowing my code. It's don't create the code bigger, because all of these things, when we are compiling them, they don't create us any styles. Because of that, I'm calling them no styles. And in this way, you are getting all the powers of Sass in every one of the components. And let's talk about the main key takeaways that I want you to take from this talk. First, create the separated CSS native variables file. In this way, you can use the CSS native variables in every way, in every place in the project. Separated all the other stuff to the two main categories of no style and as styles. And use the utility classes. In this way, you're describing the code in a better way, and you understand when you are seeing those classes in the HTML, like U for utility, is for state classes, E for entity, and P for pages. And in all of the independent components, load the main no style SCSS file. In this way, you are getting all the powers that we have in Sass, like Sass variables, Sass mixin, and Sass functions. And if you want to dive more to CSS architecture that I created over the years, you can read a lot of them and to find them in my own articles on medium.com. And we didn't talk about a lot about how to create responsive design, how to support the RTL LTR website, and how to create a CSS architecture for multiple websites. You can see all of those articles in my own Medium account. And before we finish, my friends, I was Elad Shechter, and if you want to see more of my stuff that I'm doing on CSS, you can find me in those social networks. And my friends, thank you very much for listening.